Excellent. Okay, so let's begin. It seems like you had some glitches on your ends today, but I also had on mine, so I was not able to get sources, but I'm sure we'll manage anyway.
Yes.
So what I'd like to do is spend a little bit of time before Pesach discussing, the psukim in the beginning of Parshas Bo and the Korban Pesach for some of the, themes that are so, let's say, central to the upcoming holiday. So in Parshas Bo, Perek Yud Beis, the Torah begins in a way that is very familiar to us. It's a celebrated beginning that, according to Rashi, in the beginning of Bereshis, could have been the beginning of the starting point of the Torah itself. In other words, in Perek Yud Beis of Shmos, the Torah discusses the concept of HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodashim, Rishon Hu Lachem L'Chadshei Hashana. So let's just read inside for a minute. The Torah tells us in Parshas Bo, Vayomer Hashem Moshe ve'ela Aaron be'eretz Mitzrayim lemor, HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, this moon, or this month rather, is to you, Rosh Chodashim, Rosh Chodesh, Rishon Hu Lachem L'Chadshei Hashana. So we're all familiar with this pasuk. It's where the Torah introduces the first mitzvah that is commanded to the tzibur, to the collective of Klal Yisrael. And according to, as I alluded to, Rashi in Bereshis, it could have been the beginning of the Torah itself. The first Rashi in Bereshis says that the Torah, let me read that very quickly, although we're all very familiar with it, but just the beginning part of it. Rashi says, commenting on Bereshis bara Elokim, the first Rashi, Rashi says, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak lo hayatzarech lahatchila Torah ela me'achodesh hazeh lachem. She mitzvah rishona shenitztavu ba Yisrael. And actually, the reason that we did not begin with that is because koach masav higid liamo, in order to establish our connection to Eretz Yisrael. A very fascinating Rashi that everybody is familiar with. So obviously, these psukim in the beginning of Parshas Bo, even though it didn't end up that way, but the fact that they are an alternative potential beginning, candidate for the beginning of the Torah itself, obviously, we take note. Obviously, the principles that are transmitted, in these psukim are crucial. Okay, so what are these principles? So at minimum, it's the concept of Kiddush HaChodesh, the fact that Klal Yisrael is a junior partner, together with the Ribono Shel Olam, in establishing halachic time. That partnership, speaks volumes and eloquently about the, stature that Klal Yisrael was intended to achieve. The Ribono Shel Olam entrusted them, to implement, Kiddush HaChodesh. But it's more than that. It's also a reference specifically to Rosh Chodesh Nisan, because it's not just HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, it's HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, Rosh Chadashim Rishon Hu Lachem, L'Chadshei Hashana. So what's so great about Rosh Chodesh Nisan? The first of the months, maybe. In some respects, the Torah, might have been, this might have been a place for the Torah to begin because, Bereshis is about, Brias Shamayim Ba'aretz, and it's very universal. It applies to all mankind. But actually, Rosh Chodesh Nisan and the focus on Yetzias Mitzrayim is a much more, specific accentuation of the role and the destiny of Klal Yisrael and the bond between Hashem and the Jewish people. So in the same way that, in the beginning of the Aseret HaDibros, it's Anochi Hashem Elokecha Asher Hotzeisecha Me'eretz Mitzrayim, which is also fascinating, and all the Mefarshim ask what happened to Asher Barasi Shamayim Ba'aretz. and different answers are given, to that question. The Ramban's preferred answer is that there's something about Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim that theologically and nationally, goes beyond Asher Barasi Shamayim Va'aretz, because it's about the bond and the special election of Klal Yisrael as an Am Segula, as an Am Hanivchar, as a Mamlechas Kohanim B'Goy Kadosh. So when the Torah could have begun at HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, it's not only the concept of Kiddush HaChodesh, it's also connected to the events that take place in Nisan, namely Yetzias Mitzrayim. The Torah has two presentations of Shabbos and the Aseret HaDibros. In the first one in Yisro, it's connected to Brias Shamayim Va'aretz, Kibo Shavas Mikol Malachto. That's very understandable. The second time in Parshas Va'aschanan, it's connected to Yetzias Mitzrayim. And the Ramban, in the end of Parshas Bo, and throughout his Perush al Torah, but that piece in the end of Bo is like a very seminal expression of it. Says that we find Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim, remembering the exodus of Egypt. We find it very ubiquitously. It's all over the place. It's it's anywhere and everywhere. And Ein Ze Omer Ela Darsheni, kind of, the Ramban says, like, why do we keep mentioning Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim, Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim? Everything is Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim. Even things like mezuzah and other things that don't seem to have anything to do with Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim, even they're Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim. So the Ramban explains again, because Brias Shamayim Va'aretz zeroes in on, the universal history of the world. Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim is about the bond with Klal Yisrael. Brias Shamayim Ba'aretz establishes divine omnipotence. Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim establishes not only omnipotence, but divine providence. The Ribbono Shel Olam's interest in intervening, his ability to intervene in history, and his interest in so doing. And in some respects, Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim confirms, but also transcends Brias Shamayim Va'aretz. So when the Torah could have begun, in theory, on the Chodesh Hazeh Lachem, it's not just Kiddush HaChodesh, and it's not just because it happens to be the first Rosh Chodesh, the one of Nisan. It's undoubtedly a nod to Yetzias Mitzrayim. In addition to that, it's also and again, these are all possible explanations of why this would have been a good place to start. In my opinion, they're not mutually exclusive. It could be one of these. Either one in its own right makes a lot of sense, is very compelling even, I would add. But they're probably, in my opinion, connected and overlapping as well. So the third one has to do with the fact that this is the one that Rashi actually emphasizes, and that is, this is the first mitzvah tziburis that is given to Klal Yisrael. Again, as I say, it's not mutually exclusive. It's entrusting Klal Yisrael with a certain, destiny. It's establishing that there is a peoplehood, that is singular among the peoples of the world, and giving the tzibur, this salvation, a mitzvah, as opposed to what happened previously, which was there were mostly the history of the avos, great individuals, and there were a couple of individual mitzvahs like Mila, that were referred to. But the first mitzvah tziburis is HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, and therefore, from that point of view, it also qualifies, as being a very singular, group of psukim, and maybe a candidate in the end of the day for Tchilas HaTorah. It didn't end up that way, but it could have been. But I think if we then read the next pasuk, given what I've just said, so then it's very intriguing, and I think very suggestive, that we need to go further. What is the first mitzvah that Klal Yisrael are commanded on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, in the context of Zechiras Yetzias Mitzrayim? So the first mitzvah, beyond being Mekadesh is HaKodesh itself, and it's almost like a seamless transition in the narrative, is Rishon hu lachem l'chadshei hashana, dabru el kol adas Yisrael lemar, speak to the entire nation of Israel, saying, so far so good, because we want the focus to be on Am Yisrael, on the nation, at this point. It's the cultivation of that status of nationhood. It's nation building, if you will, not the way they mean it, in the news, but establishing this identity as a tzibur that we're talking about. So it's dabru el kol adas Yisrael be'asor lachodesh hazeh, on the 10th day of this month, and tell them v'yikchu lahem, that they should take ish sela beis avos sela bayis, that each individual, right, ish should take a seh, right, take a lamb, lebeis avos, right, sela bayis. So number one, is this, we would have expected if there was going to be a korban that was going to be offered up, in order to establish, the symbolic, impending nationhood of Klal Yisrael, and especially once it's introduced by Dabru al Kol Adas Yisrael Emor, and especially, if being a mitzvah tzibur was what, singled out Kiddush HaChodesh to begin with, so we would have expected that Klal Yisrael would be commanded to bring, as a collective unit, that they were expected to bring a korban. Instead, Klal Yisrael is instructed that each individual, right, should acquire a korban for his unit, which in the time of Pesach Mitzrayim meant family unit, his home, where the domicile where he lived. And the Dore Doros means the group that is, collectively, going to take part in the Korban Pesach. And then the Psukim continue to detail this. Imyim atabayis mios miseh v'lakachu shkeno hakarov elav b'mitzas nefashos ish lefi achlo techosu alaseh set tamim zachar ben shana yelachem bin hakvasim bin ha'izim tikachu. If, you sometimes have to, calibrate, everybody is obligated to eat from this korban, therefore there can't be too many people, can't be too little people. So sometimes it's not the family unit, it's going to have to be adjusted. But this is the focus of the very first mitzvah after establishing, the importance of Chodesh and Chodesh Nisan. The first mitzvah that is addressed to Klal Yisrael is a mitzvah which itself is not seemingly, classically at least, a mitzvahs tziburis. On the other hand, as the Torah continues, to describe it, the description gets even more challenging. Vayalachem lemishmeres, this is pasuk vav, ad arba'asar yom lachodesh hazeh, because really the action is going to take place on the 4th of Nisan. That would be Friday, for example, this year. Shabbos is Chag HaMatzos. Friday is the, Yud Daled. If there was a Beis HaMikdash, and a Korban Pesach, it would be brought this Friday in the afternoon. So we're being told, keep the seh that you designate and set aside, keep it reserved for, the big event on the 14th, right? And then we're told, v'shachatu oso, and you should slaughter it. Kol kahal adas Yisrael, very strange. You should slaughter it, all of Klal Yisrael collectively, right? Bein horbayim, in the afternoon at Chatzos, or a little after Chatzos. What does that mean? V'shachatu oso sounds like, how many people do an act of shechita? Obviously, only one. You don't have 100 people, with a shechita knife. So shachatu oso, yet the Torah describes it as kol kahal adas Yisrael, a double formulation of the collectivity of Klal Yisrael, so through triple actually, kol kahal adas Yisrael, Bain Ha'arbayim, and then the Torah continues and so on. The Gemara in Masechet Kiddushin, in the second parak, suggests the Gemara there is the second parak of Kiddushin begins Ha'ish mekadesh ba'u b'shlucha, Ha'isha miskadeshes ba'u b'shlucha. The Mishnah and the Gemara discusses the topic of agency, shlichos shel adam kimoso, right? Can you appoint somebody, on your behalf to betroth your wife, for you? So the Gemara says, yes, we can have somebody stand in for him, somebody stand in for her. We don't typically see this in most weddings or any weddings, but in theory, there could be shlichos in Kiddushin. So the Gemara in the beginning of the second parak of Kiddushin is interested in finding a source for the principle of shlucho shel adam kimoso, that that agency works, that you could have somebody stand in for you, and that his actions will legally, count, for you. Okay, why am I telling you this? So one of the sources that the Gemara suggests for shluchos shel adam kimoso is this pasuk: the shachatu oso kol kahal adas Yisrael beinu arba'im. Why? Because the Gemara says who's actually doing the shechita? One person, right? And yet it's called the shechita of kol kahal adas Yisrael. So you see that one agent can represent others, in this case, many others, for Korban Pesach. It's interesting. The Rambam, when he formulates the mitzvah of Pesach, in some places, formulates it as the mitzvah of Shchitas HaPesach. In other places, Asiyas HaPesach or Akravas HaPesach. But in some places, it's Shchitas HaPesach. The Shchita plays an outsized role in Korban Pesach. It's a korban which focuses on the achila, not on the zrika. There is zrika, but it's not a korban that focuses on kapara. It focuses on achila, and the shechita plays an outsized, very prominent role. And the Rambam describes it as, in some places, in the Kotera and Sefer Mitzvos, as a shechitas korban Pesach. And some of the Mefarshim ask, they say, how come shechita is getting, even in the formulation of the mitzvah? But that's because this pasuk, b'shachatu also kol kahal adas Yisrael, is so prominent. It's like the first thing that the Torah tells us that you do with the korban Pesach. And it's shlucho shel adam kimo. It's as if every member of Klal Yisrael is involved in the shechita.
Right. You usually it's the eating that's the emphasis, right?
Say that again.
Usually the eating would be the emphasis, and here it's emphasizing the shechita part of it.
No,
normally you would actually emphasize the zrika, the hakrava, the sprinkling of the blood, and here the Torah emphasizes the part.
But if you do shechita and zrika and you don't eat it, I mean, are you yotze Korban Pesach?
No, you have. It says achos habasar b'layla zeh. You have to eat it, and not only that, we'll get to this in a minute. But you have to have the ability to eat it. Otherwise, eat a kazayas. Otherwise, you can't even be included in the chabura.
But I think the point you're trying to make is that in other korbanos, it's a zrika that gets the focus.
So what I'm saying is the shechita plays an outsized role, but more the bigger point I'm trying to make is that the Torah addresses the tzibur. It's a tzibur context of Kiddush HaChodesh, which is why it would have been the beginning of the Torah, and we're getting very mixed messages because on the one hand we're talking to the whole tzibur. We're considering this in some respects a mitzvah tzibur, and even as that is the case, we are really asking individuals and groups, to take the lead. And the shechita is how many shechitas are there? The answer is it depends how many korban pesachs there are. Well, let me say it this way.
Is the principle
typically other korbanos?
May I ask this question?
What's that?
Is the principle of shlichus that which determines the unity of the people of Israel, or is it rather the principle of the bris?
Well, shlichus doesn't have to determine the principle of the unity.
But it does. It creates a unity of the people of Israel. Everyone could represent everybody else.
Right. I hear that. It's an interesting idea. We'll get back to that. But obviously, that could also be done not, for all of Klal Yisrael, but for just individuals. In other words, if I want to get married and I want somebody, I can't make the wedding because I have a business meeting or shir to give, and therefore I send a shliach, to the wedding, in my stead to pop the question. So the shliach is not representing Klal Yisrael; he's representing an individual, right?
Well, this is true.
Which I think what you're saying, which I think
this
is
true of bris as well.
Yeah.
Yaakov made a bris, I believe, with his father-in-law.
Right. Yeah, correct.
So you can have a bris of a handful of people. But the point is, it seems that to me, that the bris, which defines the relationship of the Torah to the people of Israel, and Eretz Yisrael, which does so as well, are more fundamental concepts of the unity of the essential unity of Klal Yisrael than shlichus.
Yeah, I agree with you. Shlichus is more individual. So that's why it's very interesting that the first thing we're told about the Korban Pesach, even though the Eidah is being addressed, is V'shachatu oso kol kahal Yisrael, which the Gemara thinks is shlichus. So I'm going to try to explain that. I agree with you. I totally agree with you. So let's take it a step further for a moment. The principle of Korban Pesach is really unique in so many different ways. We've talked about this in the past, as well. There's nothing, quite like Korban Pesach. It defies, any analogy, in one respect. And it's interesting that, the Torah describes it as an avoda, right? Lezikaron. One second, I'm just trying to find the right pasuk. The Torah says that here, if you look here in pasuk, if anybody has a chumash, Parakid base, pasuk. Well, first let's read Chaf Aleph. Vayikra Moshe lechol ziknei Yisrael. Once again, he's addressing all of Klal Yisrael. Vayomer aleihem, and he says to them, Mishku ukhu lachem tzon. Limishbechosechem, right? Draw, towards your homes, each of you a tzon, sheep. V'shachatu hapasach. Okay? So, but then if you look further in pasuk Chafei, the Torah says, V'hayaki savo la'aretz asher yitein Hashem lachem kasher diber. When you come into Eretz Yisrael and, you are able to accomplish, which Hashem will give you as he told you, and you're able to accomplish this mitzvah, ushmartem, you should preserve eswa avoda hazos, this avoda. And then the next pasuk says, V'haya, ki yomer aleichem b'neichem, we're all familiar with this from the Haggadah, if your children turn to you and they say, Maha avoda hazos lachem, like, what is this avoda, right? V'amartem zevach pesach hu la'Hashem asher pasach al batei b'nei Yisrael b'Mitzrayim b'nogvos Mitzrayim v'esbatenu itzil. And then this part concludes, Vayikod ha'am vayishtachavu. Okay, so two things. Number one, the Torah itself is kind of recording that this is an unusual korban. We know it's unusual korban if you just look at it objectively. But what the Torah is telling us that children are going to turn to their parents and query them about this, singular character. That's what it means. Right. So the Mefarshim on the spot, some of them say, Ma avoda zos lachem means, like, what is how do you justify this rule-breaking korban? The Rashbam, for example, says, Maha vodazos, hamishuna, mishar yamim tovim, mikama devarim. This is just, it doesn't fit in. He zeroes in on yamim tovim. We'll get back to that.
Why do you have to go there? Why isn't just the fact that it's not a Yom Tov? It's done before the Yom Tov. That's the major differentiating factor.
Well, we'll get to that. I think it's curious that he calls it, a Yom Tov. But Hamishuna Mishar, what he means is other Yom Tov don't have any karbanos like this. You're saying, and it's also before. So that's what some of the other Mefarshim say. Look, for example, at the Chizkuni. Chizkuni says, Ma avodah zos lachem, shar avodos holchos achar ha'itim. It's a different question. It's interesting. It's like a tabula rasa. It's open season. The Torah says that the child says, like, what's going on here? So each of the Mefarshim are open to think, what they think is the most unusual thing about the korban. So it's like a great window, into it. So the Chizkuni says, I don't understand. Shar avodos holchos achar ha'itim, omer betezayin benisan, shu es katsir sa'orim, shtei alechem b'shisha b'sivan, shu es katsir chitim, dalad minim shabelulavs, es asifas peiros, aval avzoda zu, shabi yadalad benisan, mativa. He's, like what's the a little bit what you're saying, but not exactly half of what you're saying. What's the yichus of Yadal? The others are agriculturally significant. The karbanos are agriculturally significant, and therefore they come at a time, what is appropriate to them. But what's the yichus of Yadal, and what's the agriculture? There's no agriculture. It's like, what's it all about, right? The Ibn Ezra.
He wants to take the position that the karbanos on Yom Tov are not about the Yom Tov itself, but about the agricultural coincidence of the Yom Tov.
Well, I don't like that view. It's like a very popular view in Eretz Yisrael. I'm not into that at all.
In other words, Shavuos is Matan Torah, but it also has an agriculture.
Yeah, no, I think no.
Sukkot is because Sukkot Shabbat B'nai Yisrael.
I see it the other way.
It also has a gathering in of the.
No. I mean, it's undeniable. Chag HaSiv, Chag HaKatzir.
Right.
Of course, the cycles of Eretz Yisrael, the agriculture of Eretz Yisrael, is definitely intertwined. A lot of Eretz Yisrael Talmidei Chachamim, see this as like the prime. Everything is because they see everything is about the land and the agriculture. I see it the other way. There's a certain kedushas hazman. Obviously, it's connected to the history and the events and the values that we project in on these various moadim. And that also, coincides with and gives, added significance, to the agricultural cycle.
Would they take the position that that if there was no Matan Torah and there was no Sukkot or Shabbat B'nai Yisrael, that we still have those?
I don't think so. I think it would be impossible to say that. I think that that far, I don't think you can say. But again, the question is, what do you emphasize? Here, the Chizkuni is saying, oh, the other ones are agricultural, this one's not. But other Rishonim, again, speak about, other things. The Sforno says the following, Ma avodah zos lachem, she'ena b'yom rekar kodesh. This is what you asked.
Yeah.
It's typically a korban is brought on a yontif. Kishar karbanos. V'lo toksman shar karbanos. Shumi tamid shel shachar, tamid shel ben rabayim. Not only that, but usually a korban is brought like within the framework of korbanos in the mikdash. I mean, there's a korban tamid in the morning, a korban tamid ben arbayim, and all the korbanos called aleh hashleim. All the korbanos are brought in brackets, in the framework, in the context of the tamidim. One of the only exceptions.
Also, a korban that has a secondary opportunity.
Absolutely. Well, that comes later. You can't really ask that in Parshas Bo because we don't know that until Parshas.
There's also a korban that all Klal Yisrael can bring if they're all tummy.
So that's what I want to get to. Just one second. So what I'm trying to show is that part. This Sforno has two questions. Number one, three questions, 3 points, right? Again, the Rashbam has his, the Chizkuni has his, the Sforno has three. Number one, it's not a Yom Mikra Kodesh. Not so simple. We'll get to that. Number two, it's brought outside the framework of other karbanos, right? You dafka bring the korban pesach after the tamid shel ben arbayim, But number 3 is Lama lo yaspik korban echad l'chol Yisrael kamo b'shar korbanos tzibur. Why are you bringing multiple korbanos? Every other korban, musaf or any korban is a korban tzibur that a single individual brings, right? So we just rattled off 6, but there's way more than that. Way more than that. Later on, the Torah says, Zos kukas ha-pesach, kol ben nechar lo yochal bo. Right? 2 things. Number 1, the phrase Zos chukas ha-pesach was picked up by the Medrash. And the Medrash says, you know what? We have a very similar phrase, Zos chukas ha-Torah, regarding paraduma. Obviously, there's some, monumental significance to Korban Pesach, just like there's a monumental significance to the paraduma, which is the source, the only source of tahara from Tumas Meis, the most extreme.
Saying that it's equally illogical. It's a bad expression, but equally.
So some people say that just like paraduma is an enigma. I think there are 2 things. Number
That's
1,
a better word, enigma. Yeah.
There are 2 things. Number 1, Korban paraduma is an enigma, and this is an enigma. It's an enigma because there are like so many unusual phenomena, right? Number 2, paraduma is a chukas haTorah. It's a big word. It's not just the chok part. Chok has a double meaning. It's chukim as opposed to mishpatim. So there's the sense that we don't understand. It's enigmatic. It's perplexing. But it has another context. And like the big chukas haTorah. This is the law of the Torah, and we're saying this is the law of the Pesach, meaning it's a linchpin.
Fundamental aspect of.
Yeah. So paraduma is fundamental because, as I say, it's the source of tahara b'tumas meis, which is the worst. If you couldn't get out of tumas meis, you would be stymied, and the whole Beis Hamikdash would shut down essentially. Similarly, Korban Pesach obviously is like a linchpin korban. Well, it is, isn't it? It's a mitzvah sheish bakares. Only Mila and Korban Pesach are mitzvah saseh, which if you neglect, you suffer the penalty of kares.
But also chometz has the same issue, though.
The what?
Chometz has the same.
But chometz is a lav. Chometz isn't an aseh. Chometz is if you eat it, and you're not allowed to. It is very severe for sure. But the abstaining or the sheval tasa, passively ignoring the obligation in Mila and Korban Pesach, the only mitzvah saseh that have that status.
Right.
Not only that, but the I've mentioned this in past times. The Torah in Parshas Bo, and again in Parshas Ba'aloscha in Bamidbar, says V'chi agur itchem ger. If there's a ger like among you, so there's an obligation for him also to be involved in Korban Pesach. Okay, so 1 second. Kol hadas Yisrael yasu oso. This is possible.
Talking about a ger or a ger toshav?
What a ger?
A real ger or a ger toshav? What are we talking about?
No, a real ger. A non-Jew is not supposed to bring kol benechar le'yochal bo.
Yeah, so what's the chiddush that a ger takes part in?
1 second. Kol hadas Yisrael yasu oso. That's a pasuk mem zayin. Again, every member of Klal Yisrael is obligated. The chi agurit chager, and if you have a ger tzedek living among you, asa pesach l'Hashem, and he brings a korban pesach, himo lo kol zachar v'az yikrav laso. So v'yak ezrach haaretz v'kol harel le'yochal bo. So listen to this sifrei that Rashi quotes both places. 1 second, let me see if I can find it. 1 second. Oh, I'm not finding it here. I thought Rashi quotes it. Definitely the Medrash quotes it. I thought Rashi quotes it here as well. Basically, the way the drasha goes is as follows. The Mechilta and the Sifrei will say that you would have thought that anytime a ger is miskayer, anytime during the year, he would have to bring a korban pesach. Because it says v'chi yagur itcha ger, right? But since it says Azi Kravla, so, etc., so it's only on Pesach. So a lot of the Mefarshim ask, why would anybody think that you should bring a korban Pesach when you're Mizgayer some other time during the year? Let's say on Hanukkah you want to become a ger, on Rosh Hashanah, right? You want to become in the middle of the summer. You want to become a ger. So we need a limud to tell you that you don't have to bring a korban pesach in July, but we do. Why? We thought that this korban is so unusual, so chukas pasach, right? That it's a requirement for gerus. What the Torah actually does say is zos chukas hapesach. Now, normally, what that means is a meshumad, somebody who was born a Jew, but who has turned his back on the religion. So that's called a ben nechar or a meshumad. We talked about him when we learned chulin a lot, a couple of years back. So kol ben nechar leyochel, he's not allowed to eat korban pesach. He's not allowed to eat it. According to the Rambam, the pshat is you're not allowed to give it to him. You're not allowed to feed him korban pesach. That's not true of other korbanos. Can a meshumad participate in other korbanos? Mostly, the answer is yes, as long as he's not in the state of.
Is that because of the chabura concept?
It
somehow contaminates the chabura.
It doesn't seem like that's directly the case, maybe indirectly. But the problem is not that he can't be part of a chabura. The problem is he's not allowed to eat korban pesach, even if he was part of the chabura. So, on the one hand, a ben nechar, and a non-Jew, by the way, a nochri can participate in certain korbanos, but he can't participate in the korban pesach. And neither can a meshumad. On the other hand, the Gemara thought that if a person is miskayer in the middle of the year, on Hanukkah time, or Purim, or as I say, in the summer, that you have to bring a korban pesach. So how come that's a strange idea? And the others are strange facts. They're not just, possibilities. Like what's going, but the answer is it's asay sheyesh bakares, like Mila. Meaning, there's something about when we say zos chukas haPesach, like zos chukas haTorah, as we said before, we're not just talking about the enigma. We're also talking about what? The role that it plays, the outsized role that it plays. Going back to how I started. How did I start? I started by saying that the Torah could have begun in Parshas HaChodesh, right? Parshas HaChodesh means the concept of Kiddush HaChodesh. It also means Rosh Chodesh Nisan specifically. It also may mean Zechiras Yitzias Mitzrayim, as opposed to Brias HaOlam. It may also mean the first public, mitzvah given to Klal Yisrael. But the very next pasuk, what you're told to do on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, which is, being catapulted here, is what? To speak to Klal Yisrael and to make sure that each individual brings a korban pesach for his group. Wow, that's pretty big. But now we know there's kares, there's no nechar. We might have thought that there was gerus. It's called chukas haPesach, just like chukas haTorah. Let's go even further. The only time that the Torah uses the expression avoda, we said before, it's an avoda, and v'chiyomru, like, ma avoda hazos, ushmartim es avoda hazeh. This is not so well known, at least I don't think so. But some of the Mefarshim note it. When we hear the word avoda, we think we think of korbanos, correct? Or tefillah, because tefillah is connected to korbanos, right? What is it we think of? Right? Al Gimel Dvarim Ha'olam Omed, Torah, Avoda, Milas Chasad. What's Avoda? It has like two meanings. Avodas Hashem, broadly, and it also means Avodas HaKarbanos, more specifically. And because of the connection to Korbanos also, Avoda Shebelev is Tefillah, fine. But the term Avoda in the Torah, in Torah Shebechsav, is very rare. And in Korbanos, it appears only in context of Korban Pesach. That's a very remarkable thing. When the Torah says, that the ben will say to the father, Maha avoda zos lachem, and then all the Mefarshim are scrambling to say, what they're really saying is, how come it's so unusual? Part of the unusual aspect of it is that it's called an avoda, as if to say this is like the super avoda. Wow. But okay, that explains the kares, that explains the hava mina of gerus, that explains the exclusion of meshumad, that explains, why it's right smack in the beginning of what could have been the beginning of the Torah. The first thing Klal Yisrael is informed about on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, itself, meaning it's the quintessential avoda. That's very remarkable, right? So there are, indication after indication after indication that Korban Pesach is just not only rule breaking, but that it is pivotal, foundational, that it is, a major, principle of Yadus. But the question is why? Let me add one other thing, and then I'll try to get back to why I think. Again, the Sforno said, like, it's not even brought on a Yontif, on a Mikra Kodesh. But those of us who learned Psachim, last year, I'm not assuming that everybody on the Zoom, is in that category, but we did learn it last year, so I know some of you definitely were with us through the year. So we know, at least I've tried to push this idea, it has very strong roots, that there is some evidence that Yom Yadalit is a kind of quasi-Yom Tov too.
Yeah, right.
Right? And what makes it a quasi-Yom Tov? The Korban Pesach itself.
Pesach itself, yeah.
So when you think about it, what the Sforno's comment is like so fascinating, because Sforno says, "Ma avoda zos," like what's the story with this korban that's not even brought on a Yom Tov? But there's evidence that not only is it brought on a Yom Tov, it creates the Yom Tov.
Yeah, but that's a little circular reasoning, isn't it? Because we have to
No, that's right. Then that wouldn't be the question, but then you could ask the question in a different way.
It can create the Yom Tov. In other words, if
I was going to ask the question, I wouldn't say, how come this korban is brought on a non-Yom Tov? I would ask the question, how come this korban is so unique that it can create its own Yom Tov?
Correct, yeah.
I'm not saying the Sforno says it. I'm saying in light of the Sforno. And with respect
Honestly,
to
it
what
does create its own Yom Tov. The Chag HaPesach, according to many, is the first day of the sequence of Chag. The rest of Yom Tov is Chag HaMatzos. So there's special Yom Tov.
Again, you've been with us for many years. We've been discussing this, but 100%. But isn't that itself remarkable?
Yes, of course.
So meaning that how did this avoda turn into a quasi Yom Tov with a korban chagiga sidalid, maybe with Isur Malacha according to the Rambam, and a little bit according to the
what wasn't the first korban Pesach truly a quintessential event in Jewish history?
Yeah, it is. For sure it was, and that's part of this for sure. Remember, this is Parakid based, right? Coming right in the, we're discussing these dinim and like in the middle of the unfolding of the story itself. 100%. This is Pesach. We're in the middle of Pesach Mitzrayim here, and we're already drawing halachic conclusions. It's fascinating. But again, as I said, you could have it. When I say it's Chag HaPesach, and I like to say that Chag HaPesach is erev, Chag HaMatzos,
right?
Based on this idea, but it's significant, right? Like, how did it do that?
How did it earn that?
What's really fascinating about it, even more, is that it has this impact, according to many, even when we no longer practice it. Just because it's the day when it should happen, or it's mechuyev to happen, right? I mean, Bismanenu, we don't have Korban Pesach, sadly. But some of the expressions of the quasi Yom Tov we still have. For example, is the reason that Tashbisu takes place 12 o'clock, meaning Achilek, on Yom Yudalid, the day before, you have to get all rid of by Friday this year, right? Friday afternoon, by midday, earlier midrabanan, you have to do tashbisu. You have to get rid of the chametz. Why? The Torah says, "Ach b'yom harishon tashbisu sari batech." So when the Gemara in Psachim and Abdalid Omid Beis and Hamid Aleph, which we discussed a lot last year, the Gemara says, is that referring to Yom Tov itself? Or is it referring to the day before? And the Gemara concludes it's the day before. On what basis? Either the word achilek, you split the day in two, or the first day of the Gemara is because that's the time of the Shchitas HaPesach. And that's what the Rambam codifies too. So the question is, and Bali Tosis a little bit discuss it, is that so then it should only be true when there's a Shchitas HaPesach. Right? But let's say Bisman Hazeh, do you still have the biblical obligation of Tashbisu? Yes. You may even have some, Isra Malacha still. But you certainly have Tashbisu. Are you allowed to keep chametz? Are you allowed to eat chametz after chatzos? With Balamor says yes, but no one else thinks so, right? Are you allowed to derive pleasure from chametz after chatzos? Many Rishonim say not. It's a debate.
I think the Balamor
Isn't that
you eat chametz after chatzos.
The Balamor says if you
that
could,
tashbisu means eating the chametz, getting rid of it.
achilaso zui hashpasasa.
Yeah.
But that's an exceptional view. Most
Quite.
Rishonim think
Isn't
allowed to eat it.
it Isra Hanoah the rice after Chatzos today?
Some people think it's daraisa.
Right.
Yes, that's a debate. Rabbeinu David Bonfield, the Ra'ah, I've posted the Ramban and the Ravid. So that's a debate. But these are daraisas. These are biblical laws. Tashbisu is a biblical law, right? The Isra Achila, even if it's not Malchus, but you're not, according to Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rabbi Yehuda, there is Malchus.
But we have other things we commemorate that we don't do today, like Korban Omer. We have that we also don't.
Right. So is that daraisa Minat Torah today?
No.
Well, the answer is for the Rambam thinks that the counting of the Omer is daraisa, although the explanation of that, is debated. But the Balei Tosa say it's drabanan because there's no Korban Omer anymore. But when it comes to the absence of the
theory,
Korban
Chadash, for example, applies still today.
the what?
The Chadash issues, Yashan, and
So yeah, that's because there's no mati. That's the time. It might be a time.
no, we don't have the Omer, even though we don't have the Omer, the Korban Omer today.
Right, but that's because if there's no korban, then the yom is matir. It's not because of the korban, even though it's not brought. So, but this idea, the idea that a korban can generate its own quasi yom tov is unheard of. In the way the Korban Pesach does. The idea that a korban could exert such influence over so many dinim, doraisa, without even actually befoal, operating, is just extraordinary. Assuming that these things are based on that. For example, I mentioned Avelus, the Gaon of Vilna's view that the Ramah says that if a person is an Avel, on Yudalid Nisan, that he should stop his Avelus at Chatzos. I mentioned this in the past. This is the Ramah and Simin Shin Tzadi Zayin. So the Shach says, you shouldn't do that. You should go, anybody who's in Avelus, sadly, who's, had the experience of a Shiva knows there's always a Shabbos issue, right? There's no Shiva on Shabbos. When do you stop before Shabbos? Not Chatzos.
How much time as it takes you to prepare for Shabbos?
Exactly. As much time as it takes you to prepare before Shabbos. And the same thing is true for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. and Sukkot and Shavuos. So why, when it came to, Chag HaMatzos, did the Ramah say Chatzos? So the Shach says, I think it's wrong. The Gra says, I think the Ramah is 100% right. Why? Because he says the pasuk that tells you that you do Shchitas HaPesach, Beinu Arbayim, on Yom Yadalid, appears in Parsha Set. Meaning what? The fact that it's in the Parsha of the Moedim means that what?
That's a moed.
That in itself is a quasi-moed. Now, but is the Gra talking about stopping? And therefore he says, that's why the Ramah says you stop at Chatzos, because it's a quasi-moed. Is that true only when you bring the Korban Pesach? The Gra wasn't not the Gra, not the Ramah, not the Shach. None of them were living in the time when there was a Korban Pesach. Right?
Right.
So what's going on here? There's no Korban Pesach, but there's still all the dinim of Tashbih, if that's the basis.
The Ramah held that it was the Deraisa, his ruling.
It's hard to know, but even if it's not a Deraisa, why
Well, that's
is
just a Zecha. We do that a few times as a Rabbanan, a Zecha.
I mean, you might say that, but obviously the Gra isn't saying that. The Gra is saying it's in Parshas, Hamoadim.
He's equating it with full moed, yeah.
And that doesn't have to be full, but he's assuming that its presence in Emor has an impact on this din, even when Bisman Azeh, there's no korban. So it's not only that the korban, let's say when the korban was, operative, is it unusual that it would engender practically a quasi-chag? Sure, it's unusual. I don't know anything else like that. I mean, again, let me make it clear that the Yerushalmi in the beginning of the fourth parak of Psachim, says, oh, how come there's an Isur Malacha on Erev Pesach? Because everybody's bringing the Korban Pesach, just like when individuals used to bring Karbanos, it would be like a personal yontif for them. So that sounds like, it's a personal yontif for every individual because it's a time of Korban Pesach, but it's a regular din in Korban. But that's not what it sounds like in the Rambam. Rambam says, oh, because you bring a Chagigas Yudalit also. But either way, even what Tosa says, all the other Rishonim say, that would make sense in the time of the Korban Pesach, but it doesn't make sense Bismanenu when there's no Korban Pesach. Is it just a low plug? We're worried that next year the Beis HaMikdash will be built and everybody will, say, last year we did Malacha, so we'll do Malacha this year? Meaning...
Wasn't there a minority opinion or thought that maybe you could bring the Korban Pesach without the Beis HaMikdash?
Yes, that's a very, that historically, that's like maybe we'll talk about that one year. That's a massive, fascinating chapter. And then Netziv actually, as in his Hamig Davar and in his Parish to the Haggadah, says, that he says, normally you could bring, especially if you hold like the Rambam, that
that's if it's a Yom Tov.
Hamikdash and Yerushalayim are Doraisa, even in our time. So in theory, you could bring Karbanos, says the Netziv, but it's not L'reach Nichoach, because since the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, it's not L'reach Nichoach.
But if you assume, as you've been saying, that the Korban Pesach is different,
so he says, but if you look carefully, he says the term Reach Nichoach doesn't appear by the Korban Pesach.
Mm-hmm.
That's why some people thought that you could really, if you have a proper, Mizbeach and a proper, Big Day Kahuna or whatever it was, then you really could do it. Okay. So what I'm trying to show here, though, is that, even when you don't have it, it looms large. The day of, or what would have been, or the chiyuv in the abstract also has impact. Wow. Like, why? And why should that be? How could that be? But I think that there are several answers to this question. We'll start moving to a resolution. One is what I've said many times in the past, and it's always just true, and it's important to repeat. The Sefer Chinuch, again and again in his work, characterizes the Korban Pesach as the Korban of Emunah. It is, because it took tremendous resolve for Klal Yisrael to be able to, kill the Egyptian deity Ad sheyishketu Eloheim leineim. And it was a moment of emunah. That's the pshat. That's how the Chinuch explains why kol b'nei chol leyochel, why non-Jews are excluded and why mishumadim even are excluded. He says it's a korban of emunah. It's not just like, oh, a chi of korban. You have kedushas Yisrael, you're part of it, no matter what, even if afal pi shechata Yisrael. It's specifically about loyalty and faith, and trust. So you can't give it to a rebellious Jew who's a meshumad. And you can't give it to a non-Jew. It can be many wonderful non-Jews, but it's about emunas Yisrael. It's just a whole different. That's number one, and that explains a lot about Korban Pesach, a lot of the requirements and rules and so on and so forth. Aseh sheish bakares, the connection to Mila, kol b'nei chol leyochel bo. It explains many things. But I think in addition to that, it's what we said before. And because of that, it's also the quintessential avoda. It's the avoda. We just don't realize, because, again, we use the term very loosely. In Torah Shabbat avoda, in connection with Korban, means Korban Pesach. In the commentary of Reb Shamshon Fall Hirsch, he noticed that. Others did too. Not so many, though. Not so many. So he says, typically we think of avodas Hashem. And then we think of avoda, all korbanos. Says, but the Torah really only defines Korban Pesach as an avoda. He says, because symbolically, and substantively, the entry point into avoda for Klal Yisrael was and is Korban Pesach. I would just add, because of all of its unique features. So that, you might have thought it's the source for Geirus. But it doesn't explain the enigma of Daber al Kol Adas Yisrael, in the context of Kiddush HaChodesh, the mitzvah, the first mitzvah to Klal Yisrael, and V'shachatu also Kol Kahal Adas Yisrael, shlichus, they're making it sound like it's a shlichus of Klal Yisrael, and the question of how come there isn't one korban like there typically is? Meaning, this korban, what is the nature of this korban? And I think that's the overlapping third point. It's a korban amuna. It's the quintessential avoda, right? And for both of these reasons, they're all overlapping. I don't think they're so distinct. They're different emphases. The configuration of Korban Pesach is unique. Typically, we're familiar with two categories of korban tzibur and a korban yachid. Korban tzibur means a single korban brought on behalf of all of Klal Yisrael, which is what the Sforno was saying we would have expected here. I'm adding, and especially on the heels of Kiddush HaChodesh, the first mitzvah, and Daber al Kol Adas B'nei Yisrael, and V'shachatu also Kol Kahal Yisrael, and Kol Adas Yisrael Yishketu also. How can we keep speaking about the Eidah, and it's all about building the Eidah, right? We say that Mila is to the Yachid, what Korban Pesach is to the Tzibur, what Mila is to the Yachid. And that's why you also need Mila as a prerequisite for Korban Pesach, right? It's building the nation. So you're building the nation and you don't need a classic Korban Tzibur? But it's not a Korban Yachid. First of all, it's brought by a Chabura. Not only that, it has the hallmark of Korban Tzibur, even though it's not a Korban Tzibur. Right, the Gemara says in Psachim, Sabbathayim with base, that if you have to, you bring a Batuma, even when Klal Yisrael defiled, because that's the din of Korban Tzibur. If Rov are Tameh, can be brought Batuma. Of course, you bring Korban Pesach on Shabbos. You can't bring a Korban Yachid on Shabbos, right? The Tosas Rid says that typically only a Korban Tzibur has the accompaniment of Tkios, Chatzosros. He says Korban Pesach has that. because it's a korban tzibur. The Gemara says in Yoma that in some respects, korban Pesach is a korban tzibur. It's not brought one korban for the whole tzibur. The answer is because it's brought bikinufia. Everybody brings it together at the same time. It's an obligation. It's not like korban yachid where everybody just does it on their own or has an independent, discrete obligation. It's brought by groups, individuals or groups, but together. The Mishnah says in Psachim that there were three
groups.
Sivuvim, right, rounds,
Yeah.
and they would get it all in. I don't know how they got it in on 3 rounds, frankly. It seemed to need much more. They were singing, and they were saying Hallel while they were doing it, so on and so forth. Everybody's bringing it Bekanufia. So the Gemara says in Yuma, non Aleph, since everybody's bringing it Bekanufia, that's what gives it the status of Tzibur. In what? Tumah, Shabbos, maybe Chatzotzros, etc. Okay, but it doesn't completely have the status of Korban Tzibur either, according to Bali Tosas. There are some differences, even Betuma. And either way, it just isn't, it just isn't a Korban Tzibur. It's not one Korban. The Mechilta has a view that B'di'eved you could bring a single Korban for all of Klal Yisrael. And the Mefarshim have a lot of trouble with it. Because how can you do it? It has to be, each person who's involved in the Korban has to be able to eat a kazayas.
If you could bring it individually, then you should be able to bring it to people who are Talmei also. It wouldn't be a Pesach Sheni.
What do you mean?
If you can bring one korban for all of the tzibur, that would include people.
Right, correct.
You wouldn't need a Pesach Sheni.
Right. So they're bothered by it in a different way. They're saying like if you could bring one korban for everybody, then by definition you wouldn't be able to eat it. Every member wouldn't be able to eat a kazayas. Right. So there's a very famous tshuva that Achronim quote of the Zera Avram. Zera Avram was Rab Menachem Zemba, Hashem Yikom Damav, who, from the Polish, school. It was one of the great, one of the great chachamim of that school, which he says that, if he says there's a tzibur aspect to Korban Pesach, and that's why what the Mechilta means that, if all of Klal Yisrael decides they're going to bring a single korban, that would be fine. And if they did that, then there wouldn't be a requirement of kazayas l'kol echad v'echad. There are two ways to satisfy the requirement: bekinufia, in which case every individual has to have the ability to eat a kazayas, or betzibur, in which case we'll treat it like a regular korban tzibur. It's a very big chiddush, very big chiddush. In the Gemara, there's a debate whether a yachid can bring a korban Pesach if he wants to. The Rambam paskins that b'di'eved he could, but l'chatchila he shouldn't. Very interesting. What does that mean?
Without a chabur?
Without a chabur. So what I'm trying to show is
he would have to eat everything, or he has no.
No, not necessarily. But either, or if you did, but that wouldn't happen. No. So what I'm trying to show is the Mechilta's discussion is: could you have, if b'di'eved, could you have one korban Pesach for all Klal Yisrael? And then the discussion, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi and others is, and if you wanted, could you have a korban yachid without a chabura? Okay, but what we end up doing is what? And certainly the preferred, maybe the only way, I'm not so sure about these others, certainly the preferred according to the Rambam is what? A chabura. Originally it was mishpacha, right? And then they, depending on how big the mishpacha is and then the way things develop, it was a chabura, right? It's very fascinating to note, there's a concept in Karbanos, there's something called a psul yotze. You're not allowed to bring, the korban outside of its precinct when you're preparing it, and you're not allowed to eat it out of its precinct either. So, for example, kachim kalim, you can't eat outside of, Yerushalayim. Kadshe Kadashim, you have to eat in the Azara. When it comes to Korban Pesach, right? The Torah says, "Babayis echad yeyachel," pasuk memba, lo sotzi min abayis min abasar chutza. If you bring it out, it's yotze. The concept of yotze here refers to the makom of the chabura. And then the next pasuk says again, Kol adas Yisrael yasu oso. Right? So this is really, very, very strange, obviously. So like, what is going on here? The Rambam, in his introduction to the Parish of Mishnayos of Kodshim, the Rambam wrote, elaborate introductions to all the starim of Mishnayos. To Zerayim, one of Zerayim is like Hakdama to Parish of Mishnayos in general, but he wrote, in advance of Zerayim, and he wrote something about, to kind of classify or categorize, the different, the different types of karbanos, the types of taharos, the types of Zerayim. Good. So when he talks about the types of kodshim, so he addresses Korban Pesach. Just I wrote down the language here somewhere. The Rambam says, 1 second. Yeah, the language of the Rambam is Korban Pesach hu Korban Yachid ke'ein Korban Tzibur. Doesn't help us so much. Korban Yachid ke'ein Korban Tzibur. What is that? So I think, and this is how we'll conclude, but let me explain what I think is going on here. First of all, the context of the history and of this alternative beginning of the Torah, but then Dabero b'nei al kol adas Yisrael, Dabero adas Yisrael, Yikchu ish lebeis avos, ish, sela beis avos, sela bayis. They're building a nation, right? It's, you had this, ragtag, in the end of Bereshis, Vayerdu Mitzrayim, it's the family of Yaakov. The end of Psukim and the end of Aichin and Psukim, the beginning of Shmos, are practically identical. They go over the same territory, almost word for word. There's some nuanced differences in terms of, Yaakov's family, coming down to Mitzrayim. Strange. But it's intentional. The idea is in the end of Bereshis, they're coming down as a family. And in the beginning of Shemos, the family is beginning its odyssey as a nation. And like the Ramban says in his Hakdama, to Sefer Shemos, this is the Sefer Geula, this is the Sefer of Am Yisrael. Bereshis is about, Ma'isa Avosim Labanim. It's about individual great Chachmei HaMasor. So the whole story of Yetzias Mitzrayim is the building of a nation. How do you build a nation? Moreover, you're going to build this nation how? Through Avodas Hashem. Right? The quintessential Avodah is the Korban Pesach. So it's going to symbolize or epitomize, right, the methodology, of how this is going to take place. We should take, put a magnifying glass, put it under a telescope, to see how this is going to go and how this is going to work. And what is it? How are we going to build it this way? With this methodology, this avoda, as a korban emunah, correct? That's going to build the nation. But you don't snap your fingers and build a nation.
It's interesting that
What you do,
so many of the features of the Korban Pesach are also available or included in the Mitzvah of Mila.
Yeah, of course. And that's why, again, Mila is a prerequisite also. 100%.
Well, but it's also a major mitzvah.
That's why so many brisos. What you said before about bris, there are so many brisos, that are referred to in the context of Mila, in particular, because it's the individual's way of identifying with the tzibur, and with a different kind of life and a life of purpose, right? So 100%. And that's why the role that it plays, the parallel to Korban Pesach, as Mitzvah Sheish Bakares, and the requirement, not only, remember, to qualify for Korban Pesach, not only do you have to have bris milah, you have to.
I associate.
There has to be bris milah on the population that you have influence over. Milas banav v'avadav. If your children don't have a bris milah, or your servant, when they used to have slaves, so your avadim don't have a bris milah, then you.
The element of
participate in
Amunah
Korban
seems
Pesach.
to be essential to the bris milah.
The what does?
The element of Amunah.
Yeah, 100%. Exactly. So what I'm trying to say is, how do you build a tzibur from a ragtag, individuals? And how do you build a concept, an ethos of avoda, in the sense of halu avdei Hashem, velo avdei paro. They were used to a different kind of avoda. It was a mindless avoda, through subjugation. How do you build bechira chavshis, a purposeful, initiative-oriented, meaningful avoda? And how do you build an odyssey of emunah? The answer is you can't jump, even though the purpose of Parshas HaChodesh is Kol Adas Yisrael, Bayom, right? And you're addressing Adas Yisrael, and the Shachatu also Kol Kahal Adas Yisrael, but it's Shlucho Shalom Kimosa, because you can't, not every, have 600,000 people, doing a shechita, right? So the way that you do it is you have to work on 3 levels, on 3 planes. You have to work on the level of the individual. The individual is the back. The first thing you have to deal with is individual. Ish, Selebe Savos. Ish. Because when it comes to faith, it all starts with one person. And then, the influence that he exerts, and by exerting that influence, he becomes encouraged, and buoyed, and his own growth, is affected within his family. It's base avos, ish sel base avos, sel abayis. So the original chabura, again, in going forward in history, a Korban Pesach is always brought by chabura. That's the unit. That's what's unusual.
Is that why the emphasis?
But it doesn't have to be family, but the paradigm is a family. What's that?
Is that why the focus is Vigarat al-Vincha?
For sure. So that's why it's Vigarat al-Vincha and Keneged Arba Banim Dibra Torah. That's also why the Bayis Echad Yeachel v'lo Yotzei min Habayis. The Hagdara of Yotzei in this Korban isn't Yerushalayim, and it's not the Azara, right? It's the Chabura. And it's, as you say, the focus on Banim. I'll give you better than that. The Rambam's psak is as follows. If you have a katan and he's nisgadel being Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni, all things being equal, in other words, the katan's birthday is, he's going to turn 13, after Pesach, but before Pesach Sheni, right? So that's a discussion in the Gemara, but the psak is that he would be chayiv Pesach Sheni. However, if he was included in the chabura, of Pesach Rishon, then he doesn't have to bring Pesach Sheni. On the other hand, you can't have a chabura of kulo katanim. You can only have a katan being mitzaref and tafel to the chabura. So Reb Chaim discusses it in his chibur. Very fascinating. What does it really mean? It means that the family unit, makes special allowance for the inclusion of katanim, as an inclusion, as a tafel. And the kiyum of Korban Pesach that is accomplished thereby exempts him from Pesach Sheni, even if he turns bar mitzvah, if he was included in the original chabura. For the same reason that it's B'bayis Echad Ye'achel, and for the same reason that it's, the focus on Vigarata. Remember, it's the children who are saying Ma Avoda Azos. Maybe we could add to the questions of the Sfarno and the Chizkuni and the, in the Rajbam, that one of the things they're asking is like, how come the folk, what's the nature of the strange korban? Not just how come it's being brought outside of the Tamidim, and how come it's being brought when it doesn't seem to be Yantav, and how come it's, one of the questions of the Sforno is like, how come it isn't a typical korban tzibur? But it's not a typical korban yachid either. The answer is because if you want to accomplish these things, an ethos of avoda, a true, authentic, deepening, of emunah, not just a name only. That's something that goes to the core of who you are and determines how you prioritize your values and decisions and your life course. And a tzibur, based on these kind of values, right? Then you have to do it in a way that includes all three components. It starts with the yachid, the unit, the primary unit is the chabura, and that's how you build ultimately the tzibur. So actually, when we go back to the question that we started with, which is, that Rashi says in Bereshis that this, a potential alternative beginning to the Torah itself is a Chodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodashim, Rishon Hu Lachem Chadshei Hashana. There are many good reasons for that. Halachocentricity, Zeicher L'Yetzias Mitzrayim, right? Kiddush HaChodesh itself. But it's still quite interesting that the next pasuk and transition is to a Korban Pesach, which is so confusing, addressed to the tzibur, and as if to say, to create the tzibur, and yet it's ish sela beis avos, sela bayis. But then next pasuk, kol hadas Yisrael, and so on. It's like, what is that? I mean, it's not even, we're trying to build the tzibur here. This is like, and you have this, configuration that is so inimitable, for sure, but also superficially counterproductive to the point that you're trying to, emphasize, or to the accomplishment, of creating this tzibur. But the answer is, when you step back and you look at the other things the Torah says about this korban, and then you examine the halachos of this korban, right? And then you realize what the stakes really are. Then the methodology, that will lead to Hayam Hazeh Niyeh Sala'am, beyond, Yitzias Mitzrayim, but to Kabbalah Satorah at Har Sinai, and then we call it the, potential fifth lashon of Geula, Ve'evesi in Eretz Yisrael, ultimately, is all built on this foundation of ish sela beis avos, sela bayis, in the formative stages, of the transition from Bereshis to Shemos, moving forward, that becomes critical. And therefore, as an expression of avoda, the ultimate one, that's why it is, I think, also. And emunah, again, all these things are interconnected, etc. It's ma'avoda zos lachem. Why is it so different? It's different because the goal, the ambition, the aspiration, right, is lofty. It's zos chukas HaPesach, the same way it's zos chukas HaTorah, and the stakes are high, kares, and it's connected to gerus, and it's called benecha layochal bo. All of these things, all because, that is what really, beneath the surface is happening. So this is a korban that can generate its own quasi-yontif. And it can even do that when it's not applicable bisman hazeh. Just the thought of it and the remembrance of it and the yearning, expectation and anticipation that it will, come again. Even that, exerts influence, over the generations. We're inspired. And the truth is, I'll finish with this idea, that Netziv in his Haggadah in the Hagdama to his Haggadah, and also in Hamek Davar and in the Haggadah itself in Bershefer. Again and again and again, talks about, these two interrelated points. One, even though there is no Korban Pesach Bizman Hazeh, there are plenty of minhagim that we are involved with. How much matzah you eat, wearing a kittel, again, numerous things. That is all zecher lekorban Pesach in a way that that is beyond what you typically would expect to find in zechers. It seems like, again, Korban Pesach exerting like this tremendous, influence, even though it's not Chal. But not only that, but he has a very fascinating theme, which I think has very strong roots in the Rambam. This is the part that he doesn't develop, but that I think could be developed. He develops it, in a different way. His idea is that the role of matzah itself is transformed when in conjunction with or separate from Korban Pesach. In other words, bisman that there is a Korban Pesach, matzah's role changes completely in light of the presence of Korban Pesach. He even discusses the fact, he says, that there are two parshas in the Torah. The only Torah speaks about, chametz is lechem oni, which is the source that you can't eat matzah ashira. In only one of them, maybe it depends. He even wonders whether, you could eat matzah ashira, depending whether there is or isn't Korban Pesach, based on this in Hamek Davar as well as in Emrei Shefer. So this idea that the Korban Pesach has this outsized impact when it's not here, and even greater impact to kind of recalibrate the relationship between some of the prime themes of Chag HaMatzos itself, when it is further testimony to this very remarkable korban, the quintessence of avoda, and the first and maybe most important application of Achodesh Hazel Lachem Rosh Chodashim Rishon Hu Lachem L'chad She'ashana, and therefore the ingredients that are so unusual and that characterize this being unprecedented. When we think about them and examine them, they really are a methodology going forward, of how to build our own, families and lives and tziburs. And for that reason, the Korban Pesach, it seems like a distant thing and, very esoteric, and, how relevant can it be? Halacha l'maisa, we don't have a Korban Pesach. But, not just because of the impact it continues to have, even halacha l'maisa, or in the two ways that the Netziv explained, but especially on the central supreme role that it plays in terms of the themes of Pesach. There's nothing that could be more relevant. So I want to wish everybody a Chag Kasher v'Sameach, and we'll continue in 2 weeks, I guess. Afterwards.
Thank you.
Basra.
Yeah, Rabbi, do you want to do 8:00 that night? Because whatever you want. Mincha's 7:35 at the shul.
If it's better for you, we'll do 8:00.
Yeah, why don't we do 8:00 and then we'll figure out the next month or so.
Okay, great. Yeah,
we should go back to 7:30.
We don't want to ruffle the minyan goer. We want to encourage them, right?
I hope so.
Okay.
Have a great Yom Tov,
8:00
Rabbi.
it is.
Thank you so much.
Until further notice, we'll do 8:00.
Good job.
Just the week after Pesach, and then we'll work out the schedule.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay. Thank you so much for the share, Rabbi. Have a great Yom Tov.
Okay. Have a good Yom Tov, everyone, and we look
Thank
forward
you.
to continuing
Thank you.
the Basra.
Good try.
Thank you.
Best
Bye,
regards.
David.
Bye.